Good morning, everybody. This is a presentation by the National Rural Women's Coalition on the power to work flexibly. We, first a bit of asks, I guess, housekeeping. Can I ask everyone to turn their microphones off to minimise the audio feedback loop and to make it a little more comfortable for everybody? Also a reminder that this session will be recorded, and you can find it on our website and on the UN Women's website for, I think, for another couple of months or for the length of time. So we are now, I'm going to start. So good morning, everyone. We are coming together today in a very important space. The human rights space is a place of growing, learning, standing side by side together. Today, we encourage you to ask questions, share resource links, or ask questions of our presenters in the chat function. I am Leonie Noble, President of the National Rural Women's Coalition and a proud seafood woman. It is a privilege to advocate for change and work for and with rural women both in Australia and globally, and I hope you enjoyed the following session and the amazing women presenting today. They will cover a rural Australian perspective of working flexibly, the benefits, opportunities and the pitfalls we are seeing, especially in the past 2 years of COVID restrictions. The presenters will cover this topic with both role expertise and personal lived experience. Before we start, in Australia at all important events, we have an opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. We do this to show respect for our traditional owners and the continuing connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to country. Acknowledging that there is a connection between the traditional owners and the land itself allows the traditional owners to have a place at the table and to make decisions around their country. So I thank you for the opportunity to deliver an acknowledgement this morning to start the formal presentation. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm standing on today, the Yamatji people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here in this space and place today. It is now my pleasure to introduce the amazing women speaking this morning. In order of presentation, Kelly McDonald, Rochelle Lay, Jo Stewart-Rattray, Dr. Sharman Stone and Sarah Parker. Before I hand over to Kelly, the National Rural Women's Coalition CEO, who will give us an overview of the session and what it is that the National Rural Women's Coalition does in rural Australia, I'd like to introduce her properly. I'd like to introduce now the amazing CEO of the NRWC, Kelly McDonald, who will be facilitating the session. Kelly is both the linchpin of the National Rural Women's Coalition with her enormous capacity, empathy and knowledge of how RRR Australia works. Kelly understands the need to improve the visibility, access to services and voice of our rural communities, and in particular the women who live and work in rural Australia. I'd like to welcome Kelly.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen with you so you can see a few of our slides. Hopefully that's working for you all. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from the home of the Gomeroi and the mighty Kamilaroi Nation. So thank you very much for having me. So the National Rural Women's Coalition has 5 member organisations plus 3 independent directors. So it's made up of the 5 largest women's organisations in Australia, that being Australian Women in Agriculture, Women in Seafood Australasia, Australian Local Government Women's Association, Country Women's Association of Australia and the National Rural Health Alliance. So together they cover more than 3.5 million rural, remote and regional women over the ages of 18 living in Australia. We are the biggest island on earth and one of the most arid countries. So those 3.5 million women tend to live in the middle of Australia if you think of how we look at, and some of our most remote coastal lines and islands as well. So in Australia, we are the largest organisation advocating for rural, remote and regional women. And what are the sort of things that we do? We represent the diverse views of women living in rural, remote and regional Australia, and we provide that advice to government, industry and stakeholders on policy and issues relevant to the views and circumstances of rural women. So for things recently, we've been advocating on free payphones. So in Australia, we have the payphone that's on a lot of corners or in most towns and villages. And we're making sure that those stay accessible and affordable and well maintained in Australia so that rural, remote and regional women can use them. And one of our directors is covering that off a little bit further in her presentation. The other things that we've been looking at recently is other communications methods in Australia, like our regional news, to make sure that the content that regional women are receiving is both local and relevant to those women. And also things like stopping the violence in Australia, and we've also been looking at the religious rights bill just recently too. To contribute to the building of positive profiles of rural, remote and regional women is also one of our driving goals, and that's just to stop things like stereotyping of rural, remote and regional women, understanding that we are both intersectional and diverse in rural, remote and regional Australia. And making sure that when media is looking at rural, remote and regional Australia, it's in a very positive light. Our focus is on strengthening rural women's economic security and prosperity, including women's workforce participation, improving women's leadership choices, and ensuring that women and their children are safe from violence, and supporting Australia's international work on gender equality and women's empowerment. How do we do this sort of stuff? We provide free capacity building, both short and extended programs for women. They are all free, mostly to get around the great expanse that is rural, remote and regional Australia. We do a lot of online courses, but we also provide face-to-face modes as well, because we know that connecting rural, remote and regional women is where all the great stuff happens. When women are connecting and those threads of women are made together, we are so much stronger together. We consult and inform with a broad range of government and NGOs to ensure that the views and experiences of rural, remote and regional women in all their diversity is included in all their policy and decision making. And we try and make sure that rural, remote and regional women are at all levels of decision making and part of all decisions that totally impact them. We create connections between women across Australia, so we provide platforms where women can connect, where women can share their stories, where women can inspire others. Women's great issues are highlighted. So if you want to contact us, please do. There's lots of great stuff that we're doing and lots of wonderful ways that you can get involved with us. So easily, we're at www.nrwc.com.au. We're on Facebook and we're on Twitter. So I'm now going to hand back to Leonie. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. So as you can see, the National Rural Women's Coalition are always busy, and we love the space that we work in, and hopefully, you know, the difference that we're making to women is obvious and unfortunately ongoing. It would be lovely to live in a world that we didn't have to work so hard just to gain equality. So now I'd like to introduce Rochelle Lay. Rochelle is a Principal Sector Specialist in Governance, Contract Management, Procurement and Social Policy issues. Rochelle's passion lies with gender equality, equity and improving policy through advocacy, especially related to specialised issues of rural, regional and remote women and girls in Australia. Rochelle provides technical expertise and specialist advice to government and to other institutions on policy, strategy, research and advocacy in key areas of social policy, including gender equality, disability services, domestic violence, rural and regional workforce planning and employment, and technical and communications access, focusing on the news of RRR women and girls in Australia through her business Regional CoLab. Can I please welcome Rochelle?
Thanks so much, Leonie. I'm just going to share my screen. And we'll start. Are you able to see that? Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much and good morning from Australia. I'm coming to you from the beautiful Anawan country here in New South Wales, and I'm really pleased to be speaking with you all today. So I'll be talking about flexible work just as a whole. I'll give you a bit of an overview, and then the rest of our fantastic presenters are going to be kind of diving a bit deeper into certain issues. So what is flexible work? Well, it's a lot of things really. It's been made into something much larger than we ever thought it could be since the pandemic. And it's giving employees the ability to have some control over when, where, and how their work is completed. As the country emerges from its various lockdowns, Australians have been taking stock of the landscape on the other side of the pandemic. The past 2 years have seen massive shifts in demographics and population centres, with regional Australia adding record inflows of internal migrants. Simultaneously, our ways of working and living have become restricted in many respects, but also liberated in others. So the types of flexible working arrangements that we now look at are not only flexible hours of work, but compressed working weeks, opportunities to job share, part-time or casual work, purchased leave, telecommuting, time in lieu, and even unpaid leave. What does working flexibly in 2022 look like? The way that we work today is fundamentally different, we have to admit that, than how we worked a decade ago. And flexibility has definitely enabled women to re-enter the workforce, especially those of us living in rural, regional and remote Australia. As we return to the new normal, as many are calling it, many employees want these flexible conditions to stay. In fact, new research has showed that almost 40% of Australian employees will go and find a new job in the next 12 months if their current employers can't provide them with this flexibility. Gone are the days when we're working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, in the four walls of an office. Thanks to leaps in technology and a global pandemic, businesses are now running 24/7 from anywhere and everywhere. During the pandemic, many Australians experienced the working from home phenomenon for the very first time, and this flexibility and the freedoms that came with this. Flexible workplaces are now becoming the norm, and employees are increasingly seeking flexibility when, where, and how they work. This change in demand is based on shifts in workforce demographics as well, by changing expectations of that work-life integration that we have. For example, the percentage of dual income households in Australia has increased from 40% way back in 1983 to over 65% in 2013. And we now have seen the percentage of working mothers with children under the age of 18 increase by over 10% in the past decade. For women, workplace flexibility is especially important. Previous research has also showed that along with a visible and committed leadership, women believe that creating working models that support both men and women with family responsibilities is one of the most important actions to overcoming barriers to women's progression into work and, more importantly, leadership roles. So the COVID effect. We can't have this conversation without talking about the pandemic. It goes without saying that the world has changed with the onset of the pandemic, and the movement towards more flexible work may be one of those silver linings. However, this silver lining has some downside that we need to be aware of. For example, flexible work needs to be undertaken, as I've stated, by both men and women to ensure equity for women in this new paradigm, and so that they will be able to manage their own work-life balance. It's usually women, as we know, who are in non-standard employment, such as part-time or casual work. And they often do this and have to meet the demands of childcare needs, caring for sick parents or partners, as well as a myriad of other caring roles. Flexible working arrangements might support women in maintaining a work-life balance, but policies that make it easier to transition to part-time work or take leave may actually have a reverse effect, actually weakening women's position in the labour market and their lifetime earnings potential, therefore widening gender pay gaps as well. This is going to be discussed further on in our presentation by another speaker. So flexibility in technology. There's no doubt that the power of flexibility has come about through the massive advances that we've had in technology that we've seen in this past decade and more. These advances have enabled us to bring together expertise, resources, and access to funding and mentorship in ways that were never accessible just a few years ago. This has also enabled women to reskill, upskill, and choose new employment pathways, providing more economic security for themselves, their families, and their communities. Technology is absolutely the driving force of the power to work flexibly today, with the ability to work remotely through video conferencing like we're doing today, using community sharing platforms for collaboration, and even doing something like a simple teleconference where most of our phones today have a merge call button. A Workforce Gender Equality Agency study states that the proportion of Australian organisations in the private sector with flexible working strategies and policies now stands at over 70%. In addition, many organisations have already had informal flexible working arrangements for their employees. So, entrepreneurship. A global research survey from Gusto has found that approximately 40% of women entrepreneurs have launched businesses as a direct result of the pandemic. A rise in female founders is a good thing for women and for society, mainly because women are almost twice as likely than men to found a business that doubles as a social venture. This entrepreneurial revolution is something that we're very likely to look back on the 2020s as having started, because it's never been easier to start a business and build an audience so quickly. COVID has taught us that we desire both a more flexible schedule and the ability to work remotely. Entrepreneurship enables both of these things, especially for digital businesses. From website automation tools to the no-code platforms that help you build apps, you don't need to hire or be an engineer to get started today. With social media and services like email management tools, you don't need to pay money to acquire and engage an audience. This can all be done from your home at your kitchen table. The ability for rural women to start businesses in this way means that one-income families can become two-income families. Money can come into communities, economic development increases, as does women's economic security, which is so very important. Flexible working is not just for office workers, as we've said. It's also something that entrepreneurs have been managing for many, many years, managing their own rosters, taking a flexible approach to start and finish times, combining and sharing their roles with other support, including using gig economy options like Airtasker or Fiverr, for example. So what is the future of flexible? It's more than just working from home, as we've said, and there are many ways that employers can build a connected and empowered workforce. If there's one thing that we've learned in navigating lockdowns, it's that flexible working needs to stay. There are many ways employers can build a connected, empowered workforce. And some tips might include embracing the flexibility in all aspects of their business. It's much more than working from home, as we've said. Businesses need to move beyond this and look at further flexibility, such as encouraging employees to take regular breaks, go and watch their kids' basketball game, go and work from a cafe if they feel more productive there. Allowing employees to choose when they work and where, so that they don't miss out on that special family moment and other self-care activities. This is the type of flexibility that boosts morale in the workplace. It's also important to encourage social activities and downtime at work if you're working remotely or flexibly. Working from home has meant that we'll often spend too many hours on computers, on video calls, and reporting to basically prove our productivity. Trust is vitally important for all parties if flexibility is going to continue to work. Encouraging this approach ensures that employees will have clearer heads and overall employers will have a much more engaged, happy and productive workforce. It's also important that we have good internal communication networks. With a flexible workforce and employees working remotely on different and alternative hours, it can be really difficult to keep teams connected and communicating. To avoid employees feeling distant, it's really important to make sure that there are regular opportunities throughout the working week for employees to come together and connect, whether that's something like a daily team work in progress call, one-on-one catch-ups with their managers, or even some kind of water cooler style Slack channel for your teams to use when they feel like having a casual conversation with a teammate. Embracing different types of flexible is also really important. Some examples include companies that are embracing a 4-day work week. This has already been trialled in some countries such as New Zealand and Ireland, with experts claiming that the extra day gives employees an actual chance to recharge and come back to work feeling refreshed and ready to start again. And this has also been proven to improve productivity immensely. Another approach has been trying that slow week instead, where there are minimal external and internal meetings so that employees have more time to focus on their actual work of doing rather than the million Zoom calls that we've ended up facing in the past couple of years. We've already started to see what everyone is calling the Great Resignation, where employees are making choices to change their work-life balance to include more family-friendly policies. What is most important is to continue focusing on the health and well-being of our employees, embracing and encouraging flexibility across all areas of our businesses. The final thing with regards to the future of Flexible is future-proofing our workplace and our workforce. Australia and many countries globally have an ageing population, and this is expected to have a huge impact on labour force participation rates as older Australians continue to retire. Overall, participation for all people aged 15 years and over is projected to fall from about 65% in 2014-15 to around 50% in 2050. To meet these workforce needs, the Australian government has acknowledged that it's important to increase women's labour force participation rates at a national level. Changing the way Australians work and making the balance between work and life more realistic for employees at an organisational level is going to be crucial to achieving this goal. The women's labour force participation rate in Australia is still relatively low when compared with a number of other countries, including Canada and New Zealand. The examples set by these countries indicate that there's a potential to boost Australian women's labour force participation rates even further, but especially through changing workplace flexibility options. What workplace flexibility can do to help address the demographic changes that we are seeing across many industries and within organisations as older workers retire will benefit Australia immensely. However, Australian families, and more specifically women, must have the right support and incentives available in order to achieve this. Thank you.
Thanks, Rochelle. As usual, a lot of information that's really, really relevant, especially in Australia and countries close to us. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jo Stewart-Rattray. Jo is from Auburn in South Australia. Jo has over 25 years experience in the technology field, some of which were spent as CIO in the utilities and tourism arenas and 19 in the information security arena. She underpins her technology and cybersecurity background with her qualifications in education and management. She specialises in consulting in strategic technology issues with particular emphasis on governance in both the commercial and operational areas of business. Jo provides strategic advice to organisations across several industry sectors, including banking and finance, utilities, manufacturing, tertiary education, retail and government. Welcome.
Thank you, Leonie. I'm going to do the same thing and share my screen. Bear with me, it will take a little second. And of course, the big thing is always finding the right presentation. And it's none of those. Yeah, it's none of those. I might just go without it. They're just pictures, so we can live without pictures, I'm sure. Even in rural Australia, we actually live and work in a fast-moving environment, and it's a world of continual change and rapid change at that, particularly during a pandemic, and more particularly in relation to the technology that we use both professionally and more so these days personally. So I'm going to tell you about technology in the bush, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Our lives took a dramatic turn in March 2020, and I certainly remember being in the office on the 17th of March, waving my colleagues goodbye and going home to work to try to dodge the coronavirus. Most of us thought we'd be back in the office working shoulder to shoulder, just as we'd always done, in 6 to 8 weeks. Well, over 2 years later, we're mostly still at home, and I think we have to, as Rochelle pointed out, thank our lucky stars that we actually have the ability to use advanced technology to allow us to continue to work. However, it must be said that women have been severely impacted by the pandemic, again, as Rochelle has said. And in very many ways, some that I don't think we anticipated or could anticipate. And as UN Women stated at the end of March 2020, and I believe still holds true today, the COVID-19 pandemic is not just a health issue, it's a profound shock to our societies and economies, and women are at the heart of care and response efforts. And of course, that continues to be true today. women have had to juggle even more than they usually do. And I've always admired women that I work with who also have small children, and they can manage to work in professional services and balance, just as many of my colleagues on the call today do. But one of the things that's been quite difficult has been in families where there's an extended family, or women are living in shared space. It's about finding that space to be able to work quietly from home, to be able to do the things that you do, which comes to flexibility then, because some people have had to work at odd hours only because it suits the arrangement in which they live. So it's about the context of how we live and work, and about juggling, looking after our families as well. And in some cases, that's actually changed the family dynamic quite dramatically. But in my experience, women rise to such challenges. And an important way of ensuring that we can do that, I believe, is by standing together, by shouldering whatever the burden is together, and not losing our connections because we're being isolated at home during this pandemic, and indeed the way that we will probably continue to work. So through this time, connections have had to be maintained via Teams calls or Zoom. And I have to say that women have been incredibly inventive to keep those connections alive through the use of technology. Friends of mine have had virtual book clubs, as has NRWC. We had the ebook club, and things like virtual gin tastings. They're pretty good. Virtual high tea was a really great one, including the person, whoever the person was, that was, oh, look at that happened by magic. And thank you, Kelly. And so the amazing thing about that was, high tea, you could seed it with a question as well. Let's have some fun around something or other, have a discussion. The hostess or the host would send out appreciation packs with fun things and delicious things as well, as part of that. All of that was able to be done through the use of technology. I had a great time with friends over the Christmas break in the States, a couple of girlfriends. So we were able to have that Christmas catch up. So if you're inventive, you can have those water cooler breaks for work as well. Really important that you do that. But one of the things that I was really taken with in my own area was to find that a group of young mums had created a regular Zoom catch-up call to support one another while they were homeschooling. And I thought that was really inventive. So, hats off to women again. If the pandemic had been even 5 years earlier, we wouldn't have been able to do what we're doing now. We would have truly been isolated because the technology was just not advanced enough. But unfortunately, there is an ugly side to the heightened use of technology, and that's been the increase of scams. And those scams include phishing, vishing, and smishing. Now, you probably know what phishing is, but I can hear somebody out there saying, well, what are those others? What's vishing and smishing? Well, let me tell you about it. Phishing scams, as you're no doubt aware, is an approach via email that's essentially looking to get hold of your login credentials or banking details or your Medicare number, perhaps, because what they want to do is try and recreate either your access to organisational information, or they're looking to build an identity. In fact, recreate your identity, but for them. And as a friend of mine found out, a scammer had stolen mail from her mailbox and had created an identity and taken out a mortgage in her name. Now, you can imagine that's the sort of thing to be avoided. So make sure there's a padlock on your letterbox, or indeed you have a post office box. So that's the non-tech side of it. So what's phishing? Phishing is a voicemail or a scam or a phone scam. And we've all had those phone calls where somebody says, I'm from this, very well-known organisation, their technical department, I'm here to help you. Well, the answer to that is, no, you're not, and you hang up. But sometimes also the voicemail scams sound really reasonable. Again, it usually is from a reputable company. They want you to reveal personal information such as bank details or credit card numbers, and you can see where that's going to lead. And smishing is sending text messages, again, seemingly from reputable organisations, in order for you to click on the link contained in the text message. Now you can see where this is heading. And again, they're looking for passwords, they're looking for entree into your credit cards, perhaps, or entree into your bank accounts. And another really common smishing technique at the moment, and I'm sure you've all had them, is that there's supposed to be a delivery for you. And if you click on this link or pay this small fee because they've had such trouble delivering whatever it is to you, that they'll then do it. Well, of course, my husband had one recently to say that the mattress that he had been expecting could not possibly be delivered. Now, of course, that was definitely a scam because we didn't need a new mattress. But most of them are a little bit more generic than that. So what am I saying to you? Obviously, you're not going to pay the fee. If you are expecting a delivery, call the company that you're expecting the delivery from and check. Because my advice is don't click on the link. And if it sounds too good to be true, it is. Aunt Matilda hasn't died. She hasn't left you a lot of money, nor have you won the Danish lottery as I did just recently. Nor have you gotten that wonderful job at the EU Parliament paying you €2 million a year. That was last year I got that, by the way. So that's the advice. But let's get back to rural Australia more broadly. You know, we've gone from almost manual activities in most that we do in rural Australia, particularly in the agriculture space. But now we're looking at things like automated watering and feeding. And indeed, as you can see by this picture, we really can't milk cows without the use of technology in large milking dairy organisations. One of my colleagues will probably correct me on that, but this was quite interesting when talking to a local farmer. I was given all this information. So what's happened is that large farms in Australia are finding that because of the paucity of connectivity that they have, they've actually had to go and put in their own 4G mobile telecommunications towers. And you can imagine at what expense that would be, just so as they could use the operational control systems that they need to be able to gather the information. But for many of us, if we go back to the regular you and me in the bush, for many of us, we exist on mobile phone usage. It's really important. But sometimes we have to do very strange interpretive dances in order to get a signal. And I know Leonie has told me about doing that when she's on the Abrolhos Islands. Kelly's told me about that 70 k's out of Gunnedah. And I walk to the end of the street and have the same problem. So those constant battles with both phone coverage and poor internet connection have become even worse since the pandemic, particularly with internet connectivity in some areas, because in households, those connections are overburdened as a result of several people working from home, using the technology and perhaps also homeschooling as well. So the other thing that's become a really big discussion point is affordability. Telecommunications service provider options are generally limited the further bush you go, so the further into rural and remote Australia that you go. In other words, as you move from regional to rural to remote Australia, your options lessen to, and that also often is about quality as well. Not only do you have less options of providers, the quality of your service is often less as well. So the more it costs to provide a service, the more the consumer is obviously going to pay for those services, which to me seems upside down when you consider we're all walking around with more compute power in our purses or pockets in the form of a mobile phone than put people on the moon. The National Rural Women's Coalition, as Kelly mentioned earlier, continues to put pressure on both telecommunications providers and government alike to extend the provision of quality and well-maintained telecommunications services to rural and remote Australia. And most recently, to relocate resources no longer required to where they are required in the bush. In this instance, it was about the lessening use of public telephone boxes in the cities. The predominant telecommunications provider would like to sunset telephone boxes. In other words, say goodnight to them. But that phasing them out over time, because there is a decrease in usage predominantly in the cities and an increase in the use of mobile phones, might be commercially valid, but what about the social responsibility that goes with it? As this might be, there are many, many communities where terrestrial mobile coverage, mobile phone coverage, is at best limited or at worst non-existent. Our proposal is that unwanted public telephones should be moved to those areas where they're needed and because of where there is poor or little mobile coverage. Australia is a land of extremes, as you'll see on the next slide, and it is facing huge climate issues with devastating bushfires and not floods, but rather deluges. Kelly, could you change the slide for me, please? Thank you. All of this makes it even more important that women have access to telephones to be able to call for help from emergency services when needed. They also need to be able to contact loved ones, just to say, it's okay, Mum, it's okay, Dad, I'm safe during such times, and to reach out to women's services, God forbid, if they're running from family and domestic violence, which we've seen an increase in during the pandemic. Access to a simple public phone box from where a woman can call for help is absolutely necessary in such scenarios. They need to be able to, in the old-fashioned phone boxes, if they're still around, barricade themselves in until help arrives. And surely that has to be considered as a basic need, a basic right for women. So whilst technology can launch rockets and assist us to farm, milk cows, create algorithms, solve incredibly difficult mathematical problems, so can it keep women in touch with one another when they most need it, and indeed to assist them to school the kids and continue to work where it is obviously possible to work from home, all that through a pandemic. If the infrastructure exists to allow such telecommunications to occur, we will continue to implore government and the telecommunications providers to keep and, where possible, relocate the remaining 15,000 public telephone boxes in order to ensure that rural, remote and vulnerable Australians have affordable and accessible contact with others. This is a way we can empower rural and remote women and girls in all their diversity. And as former Australian Federal Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said, empowering women and girls to reach their full potential lifts the country's productivity and underpins stability. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jo. So as many of us around the globe have learnt or understood, is without communication, of which technology is becoming a major part, life gets even harder. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharman Stone. Sharman Stone is a Northern Victorian, born a fifth-generation wool grower. She is a human rights advocate, in particular championing the rights of all rural women. She was a pioneer analyst of institutional racism in Australia and helped shape the gender equity and environment protection agenda in the federal parliament as a member for Murray and in the Victorian Public Service. Sharman worked to advance Australia's standing internationally as a global ambassador for women and girls and as a writer and academic. She is an advisor to national and state bodies addressing FASD and women's sexual and reproductive health rights. She's currently a part-time professor of practice, gender and international relations at Monash University. We welcome Charmin.
Thank you very much, Leonie. And greetings to those who have tuned in so early in Australia in particular. And I'm coming to you from Yorta Yorta Bangarang country, just sort of in northern Victoria, about 2 hours due north of Melbourne. So you would think, having just heard our two speakers, Joe and Rochelle and Kelly, Leonie before that, that in Australia we had it nailed in terms of gender equality, particularly the empowerment of women to be able to be economically independent. Because we know one of the underpinnings of achieving a reduction in intimate partner violence is for women to be economically independent and to retain that independence. In Australia, we have more women with higher education than men. We have now 50-50 women graduates from medicine. We have more women graduating with law degrees than men. Likewise with veterinary science. So you must sort of from the outside look in and say, with all of our legislation in Australia, which makes it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on gender or age, pregnancy, disability, race, ethnicity, you name it, we've got all that legislation in play. You'd be thinking that rural, regional, remote women would have the same life experience as metropolitan, urban, big city women. And you might think that all women in Australia are now economically empowered just to the same extent, degree, if you like, as men. But in fact, that is not the case at all. And in some of our indicators, we are slipping backwards. And those indicators in particular show that the face of poverty in Australia, increasingly going forward, will be the face of an older single woman, divorced or never married or never partnered, who is depending on a pension. If she doesn't have her own home, then that won't be sufficient at current rates to support her into her older age. So we have a lot of issues. Now, today we're talking particularly about flexibility in the workforce. How is that going to help women in Australia become more economically independent, empowered, so they can march along shoulder to shoulder with men, no matter where they live, what their postcode, and what their intersectionality looks like. So let's look at this empowerment issue and workplace flexibility. And both Joe and Rochelle have sort of mentioned this a little, I think. Perhaps Rochelle made it one of the foci of her discussion. We're saying it's a brilliant thing that through COVID, the tyranny of distance was tackled through us being able to sit in Walgett or Burke or Shepparton or all places in between, and we could Zoom into our workplace, where before, in my case, I used to have to drive 2.5 hours to Melbourne to give a lecture on the campus at Monash. I could sit at home and Zoom. I could tune into amazing UN webinars being shot out of New York or Geneva or whatever. All of us could do that. And it was mostly free. In fact, almost universally, all of these marvelous potential experiences or real experiences were free. But there has been and is limitations to how glorious workplace flexibility through technology actually is. That woman, I mean, often with my students, for example, I would see on the screen young men and young women doing postgrad studies, and there'd be a young woman clutching a baby, or have a toddler pulling at her desk. So she was juggling full-time caring. She often also had a partner she was cooking, cleaning and managing. And sometimes others she was dependent upon for household support, elderly parents or the disabled. As well as her studies, many of those women were also working for a salary to bring in, to pay the mortgage, to contribute to the household funding. We are not superhuman women. And yet with this idea that, well, you can just work part-time now, or flexibly, or job share, or take paid leave, the job's right. Aren't you lucky? You don't have to spend those 2 hours on the road commuting on unmade roads if you're a rural regional woman, potentially. Well, the thing is, we've got to insist that our partners, if we have them, share the load. We have to agree that unpaid carer work is not the inevitable and innate role of a woman. That if you are partnered and you are going to bring salary into the home, as well as the partner, you have to share that parenting and unpaid carer role. Otherwise, the woman is subject to burnout. She withdraws, pulls back from use of her qualifications because she can't do it all. And there's an enormous expectation from her that she'll be a good mother. She'll be at the kids' school sports. She will be at parent-teacher night. She'll be visiting the 97-year-old dad in the nursing home every third day. All of those things the woman is expected to do. And if she doesn't, well, she's not really a good woman, She's more interested in herself. Shock, heaven forbid. So we've got to change our culture in Australia. We've also got to acknowledge that it's great to talk about flexibility, part-time work, working from home, all these beautiful things. If your home isn't shared with 15 others in a remote community, but Indigenous community potentially, which has the greatest overcrowding in Australia. It doesn't work if you're that overcrowded working from home, even if you've got internet connection, your Wi-Fi works, which is touch and go in a lot of those remote places. It also doesn't work for you if you're a very low paid child carer or aged care worker. You've got to leave your home and go into those places to do that work. You can't sit at home comfortably in front of your computer doing very sophisticated planning, administration type tasks for a lot of the work that Australian women do. You have to be in the workplace. So you can say, well, that's fine. She can juggle around her work flexibly and say work over the weekend and take Tuesday, Wednesday off, all those sorts of things. Yes, she can. But it's a case of, again, I say, to maximise the enormous benefits of a flexible workplace. And there's no dispute, it is a huge benefit for all men and women to not have to do 9 to 5, Monday to Friday without any variations. We've got to address the culture, the socialisation, the division of labour that is the expectation if you're born a little girl. We've got to move away from those expectations. If you just look at paid parental leave in Australia, the national scheme doesn't pay superannuation, hardly engages men at all. Most men don't take it. If we look at women who do ask for their parental leave or who are in, say, middle management or even senior management, and they say, I want to talk about more flexible workplace, please. I want to come into work now 10 in the morning rather than 8, and I want to leave at 3 because I've got the school run. Believe me, the image of her as a professional, dedicated, committed worker diminishes. We've got a lot of research showing what the attitude is towards women or men who start to talk about spending less hours in the workplace. That's got to change. We've got to change thinking about all of that. So let me say that for rural, remote and regional women, it has been an absolute godsend to be able to, during COVID, experience the same access to information, education, workplace dialogue as metropolitan women typically have. That's been a fabulous thing. So many of us have reached out and done online training. We've found if you're, for example, Centrelink supported, you can get free access to graduate diplomas, you can get HEX loans and so on. There's been enormous expansion of online course offerings from all the universities and TAFEs. That's been a marvellous thing. Even though if you're an Indigenous woman, it might be very hard to prove your identity if you're remote and haven't got your birth certificates in play, or if you're a newly arrived woman, getting your overseas qualifications verified is extremely difficult. It was during the COVID, almost impossible. Yes, there are all those things in front of you as an online education consumer. But besides all of that, now a woman at home in the remotest place can do an MBA, a graduate diploma, she can do a university course, and if she's lucky, she can go on campus every now and then to have that peer interaction. So times are great, but let me just end by saying that we have got to all of the time look at Australia's situation with our perpetuating wage gap for same work, our lack of women in parliaments at managerial levels on boards. It's improving, but it's not there yet, even though we have ticked all the boxes officially for equality. Our culture still impedes women, in particular, given that the expectation of women as the unpaid carer, nurturer in our society. So I'll leave it there and pass on to our next speaker, but say good luck to all you rural, remote women, regional women. We are the salt of the earth, and our technology is going to help us, but we need to make sure we all step up to the plate and make a difference for our daughters. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sharman. It's an interesting space that you work in, and hopefully some questions will come through for you. And we have one presenter still to go, but please don't forget to put any questions that you may have around any of the presentations that you've seen this morning, including one coming from Sarah in the chat, and we can attempt to answer them for you. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Sarah Parker. Sarah is a partner in Irrigated Dairy Farm. Sarah has executive and management experience in agriculture, extension, research and community development and education. Sarah is a director and past president of the Australian Women in Ag, a founding director and company secretary of the Australian Dairy Collective, and a member of the Victorian Farmers Federation Farm Business and Regional Development Committee. Sarah is passionate about a sustainable future for agriculture, the environment and regional communities. She strongly believes in equitable access to services and support for all Australians. Sarah enjoys working with a variety of stakeholders and is keen to see opportunities for women to develop capacity and capability delivered across rural, regional and remote Australia. Please welcome Sarah.
Good morning, everybody. I'm actually joining you from Yorta Yorta country, a hop, skip and a jump from Sharman. And I live in the Goulburn Valley in Northern Victoria. And yes, the cows are walking past outside my window, and for the first time, I'm not out milking them. So I'm really enjoying the break. I'm just going to hope the technology works and you can see my screen. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Awesome. Thanks, Leonie. So I'm going to actually talk about the lived experience in working from home. So the good, the not so good, the perks and the pitfalls. And obviously, as we all responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, many Australian organisations and businesses moved as many employees as they could to work from home. Working from home has logically been considered an employment benefit, a privilege, if you might want to say, enjoyed by many for the purpose of flexibility and managing work-life balance, but it does come with its own unique challenges, and in particular, those challenges are amplified for women. I also want to say that the research to help understand these impacts of the working from home is only just beginning. So obviously, we'll see more research produced in the future and probably begin to understand the perks, the pitfalls, and how we can manage them as we move forward. This is me during the pandemic. I normally work away from home and often in an office, but working at home meant that I had the online world where I would be attending meetings, but I still had my normal roles that I have as a partner in a dairy farm. That's milking cows, looking at production, project management, helping rear babies. And if anything, I found it really difficult to juggle because normally when I'm away from home, I don't have to focus on the farm roles that I have. But with the pandemic, we actually lost staff, which meant I was taking on additional challenges. And I do not have children, so I do not know how mothers do it. I absolutely admire them. But I also at the time was helping homeschool a 14-year-old young man that had dropped out of school and working to put him on track. And just to clarify, the technology in agriculture helps me walk away from the farm and work from home. So some examples would be, we have soil moisture monitors. We have irrigation scheduling so that the irrigation outlets are changed automatically. And in the next couple of weeks, our cows will start wearing collars, a bit like the dog collars that you see on dogs that track where dogs are. And those collars will enable me to have a quick look on my mobile phone if I'm away from home working or sitting in the house to check up on what the cows are doing, whether they're eating, whether they're walking around, whether they're healthy or not. And that'll actually free up a lot of time that we usually take up in physical observation of our cows. The last 2 years have provided a range of opportunities and benefits to Triple R women, but we have had the issues that have created additional roles and responsibilities, additional stress for some. We've had a blurring and overlapping of roles. For example, for myself, there's been work, home, caregiver, farmer. It's created a disconnect for myself personally and a disruption with what was a familiar and comfortable routine that I participated in outside the farm and away from the home. God, I miss getting on a plane and traveling. And left some women feeling that the output was suboptimal with delivery of services and or support remotely exhausting. And that comment comes from speaking to my diabetic nurse educator, who I'm yet to meet, but have been meeting remotely. And she said, as a caregiver, working in a remote sense, she struggled because she actually needs to see the patient, check the patient, and be able to interact with them face to face in order to actually really assess how they're going. So not all of us can work remotely to our optimal output is probably the point to be made there. We've had various challenges and they've all been discussed, particularly by Jo, even Rochelle and Sharman, and they probably centre around the capacity and capability of our internet connection and mobile phone service. In my farm, for example, the competing interests of homeschooling the farm and working from home have found that you've almost got to take a ticket to use the internet if you're in a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting. Another challenge for some has been finding adequate space and a suitable place. For others, work quality has declined, particularly if you're not used to working online and you're used to actually meeting face to face. There's been extended work hours, increased workloads, and others have included unrealistic expectations, sometimes created by ourselves, sometimes created by others, where there's an assumption that you're available regardless of the time because you're sitting there. And that time that we might have spent traveling is now dedicated to more meetings. My lived experience has been a positive one through COVID, but there have also been some negative times where I probably should have taken more time to think and create some structure in the working from home environment. Speaking to some colleagues that I know have struggled, some of their experiences have been feeling isolated, lonely, and disconnected from other people because they value the face-to-face contact. A loss of community and culture, particularly in teams that work closely together on various projects and outcomes. Some have also been unable to switch off from work, and myself, I'm guilty of that, sending an email at a late time when I should have been asleep. We've had reduced boundaries between work and personal life, probably even had difficulty to stay motivated, struggled to prioritise your workloads from all of the competing interests, uncertain whether you're actually doing okay or even performing well across all areas that you are committed to. And there's been that constant struggle of, for myself, family or homeschooling duties versus work versus farm. And there's the other thing of additional expenses for power, printing, phone and internet. That in the future, I believe, will actually need to be compensated to employees. And the other one is the home safe to work from? I actually went and had a chat to a lot of people that have worked from home. I've also consulted with some psychologists, and just some things that I know that I found helpful. And I myself did actually seek help to create some structure in a routine and working from home, where we need to keep a routine, continue our common rituals, make some ground rules, have clear boundaries, expectations and delineations. And they include for people that are your housemates or your family, as well as your work colleagues and your other commitments. Maintain your usual coping strategies, whether that's getting up, walking around for half an hour, standing up while working, going outside, going for a walk. For me, it's looking at the cows out the window. Structure your workday. Take a digital detox out of work, which means turn off your devices when you finish work. Don't sit there on Facebook or the other devices you might have. Avoid working from your bedroom or bed, so you have a dedicated workspace. If you have to work in your room, have a desk, not the floor or the bedroom. And seek compensation for the additional expenses. A lot of employers have sort of passed on those sort of things and haven't necessarily compensated their staff. So if you are actually working from home, you probably need to have a discussion with your employer, or if it's a contract, around getting compensated for those additional expenses. Given they're probably saving funds on travel, there's probably a reasonable expectation that you would actually receive reimbursement of those additional expenses you're now incurring. I've also just sort of, when I've consulted with the Australian Psychology Society, they actually sent me this chart. So this chart actually sums up basically what we've had people speak about today. The perks obviously are around productivity, employee perks, lower staff turnover, greater job satisfaction. We can have a positive work-life balance if we take responsibility for it and management, have benefits for working families and support working mothers. And obviously there's also the negative or potential impacts on us that I've mentioned, and a number of our speakers have mentioned. They include social disconnection, reduced cohesion in your team, restricting career opportunities, overworking, stress, and even probably that lack of opportunity to progress through the workforce, or even to progress yourself personally, because you don't have those face-to-face discussions, for example, when you might hear of an opportunity for personal development or professional development. And all of these opportunity perks, and I suppose the pitfalls, can be managed. And it often, as mentioned previously, we need to have an active management process in place with policies, procedures and protocols that support employees, contractors, ourselves from working from home. But the big step there is managing it effectively so that we all benefit. And obviously, as I said, we also have to take some self-care in there. I'm not actually going to continue waffling on. I actually think that's probably about it. And just to say to everybody, it's a great world out there online, but please make sure you manage yourself and you do what's best for you in what you do. And we have to be honest and have some honest conversations with ourselves, our family. If you're a contractor, the people that you have contracts with, and if you're an employee, your employer. And that's it from me, Leonie. I also just want to say that I also spoke to some women that work from home and have started up their own businesses. And one of the major emphases they have said, which is that they require support. And part of one of their major things was, they said there's an assumption because you work from home that you don't often need childcare. And they actually said that the childcare is what you do need, so you can be focused on what you need to do at home and drop the kids off at childcare like you would if you were going into an office. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks for that, Sarah. And yes, and childcare is becoming a major issue for women. I think it's always been a major issue for women across the globe, but especially trying to work flexibly in Australia currently. So thank you for that. I actually do have a few questions. So as they've come through, I will ask each presenter the question that's come through to, if you could answer them. We've still got a few minutes, so if anybody, any other questions that you would like answered, please put them in the chat. Rochelle, do you think that the working flexibly will be something that continues, or will we go back to business as usual as the pandemic settles?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's going to be more of a hybrid approach, especially listening to all of our speakers today. Obviously, you know, there's benefits to working remotely, but also the connection piece is still really looked for by a lot of people as well. So I think we'll probably have some hybrid form of flexibility where we might go into a workplace maybe a couple of days a week, but also have the remote work or work from home options as well. I think that employers are starting to understand that the staff absolutely want work-life balance, and that managing that means that they'll have a much more mentally healthy workplace as well. So I think that, you know, post-pandemic, definitely there'll be a combination of those different working arrangements. And I think it'll be good because it's actually looking at the person who's working rather than just looking at the work.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Sharman, how have flexible work arrangements helped to empower women economically in Australia? No, you're on mute.
Sorry,
No,
this is
you're right.
problems with technology. Flexible work means that you can often also do some, juggle some further education and training. If you're able to, for example, shift your work around to be able to fit in with lecture times, or you're given modules that you can move around yourself. So there has been a substantial interest in particular women being able to upgrade their quals with graduate diplomas and master's degrees and so on. And that in turn leads women to be more economically competitive in the workplace. I think too, this, you know, flexibility means that women are often able to perhaps do more than, I mean, this sounds appalling, I know, but I know women who are contractors, they've been able to shift around and to have 2 or 3 clients, better drought-proof themselves, if you like, rather than work 9 to 5 in a salaried position. They've been able to become contractors, offer work, say if they're very skilled with even being computer savvy, computer literate. There are women in Shepparton who've become excellent workers with support for online issues and technicalities and so on. And they wouldn't have thought about that except they had some experience of working from home. And then they thought, I can work more flexibly, I can fit in my child, family responsibilities, and in turn be more sustainable in the workforce. So there are advantages for many women, but not for all women, depending on where they work and what part of the economy. For those working in retail, for example, unless they're in a dispatch shed working for Amazon, if they're still face-to-face now as retail re-emerges, you know, that doesn't lend itself so much to working at home. So there's a whole range of jobs in the economy that still require face-to-face interaction, but if you can juggle it so that your work time, your work-life balance matches better what your stage in life cycle is. Now, at the moment, I've got a 97-year-old father that I have to manage a lot of my workspace with, to see him, look after him, take him to the dentist, to the podiatrist, the physiotherapist. And because I work part-time at Monash, I'm able to do that. He won't live forever, but while he's alive, he's my responsibility. So I can do that with my flexibility. And so that's a good thing. But as all our other speakers have said, it's got to be done in a way that's still respectful of the woman's work-life balance and her rights to a safe workplace and she isn't exploited by picking up a lot of the additional workload and the costs of flexibility, which means she's working from home more.
Thank you, Charmin. And to actually pick up on what you've just said about safety and wellbeing, I've got a question here for Jo that follows on that similar line. How does technology contribute to Triple R women's safety and wellbeing in Australia?
Thanks, Leonie. And I must say, I'm so sorry I forgot to mention that I'm actually on Nadgerry land today in the beautiful Clear Valley in South Australia. So I live and work in the driest state on the driest continent on Earth. And we're 1 week off grape picking. So harvesting is about to happen. And I'm sorry about the dogs barking, but the kids are off to the school bus. So sorry. Technology is something that I think it's a double-edged sword. It's helped women to remain or to be safe if they have mobile coverage or if they have internet connectivity. So that again in Triple R Australia is a real issue. But it's something that again, I think we should be looking at ensuring that it's affordable for women. You know, and I hear sad stories about women who can only afford so many phone credits a month. And if they run out of those, that's the end. So then they do need that public telephone box that fortunately have, there are free calls on. So that is, to me, the really most important part. We must make sure that women have the ability. And the other thing is that women also, oftentimes, if they're living in a situation where there is coercive control in the home, the partner will take that phone, her mobile phone, and be searching through it. Who has she been ringing and that sort of stuff. So how is she going to make that phone call to women's services that she needs? It's going to be that free public telephone box. So we must ensure that they remain in the bush so women have that ability, and ensure that those services are there for her to be able to pick up that phone and have that discussion. So that's how I believe technology can increase women's safety in the bush.
Thanks, Jo. I've got a question for Sarah, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us one positive that has come from being able to work more flexibly in rural Australia, and before I thank everybody and close the session. So Sarah, quick one for you. What are your top 3 tips for working successfully from home?
Maintain your routine and your rituals. So if you have a coffee after a meeting at work, have a coffee after your Zoom meeting at home. If you have a 15-minute morning tea, have that 15-minute morning tea. Have some ground rules for yourself as a person to manage your own time, but for your colleagues and your family and your people you live with. That might include putting your schedule up on the fridge and saying, you can talk to me here. One in my house is my husband has to text me. He can't call out for help as he walks in the door because I might be in a Zoom meeting. I love that, Jo. And probably the other one is maintain your coping strategies. If you meet for friends for a coffee at work, or, you know, have the chit chat round the water cooler, have the chit chat on Slack or something else. And remember that it can still be fun. I'm on a board, a catchment management authority, and we have our on the couch meetings with the team that work for us, and we still do that on Zoom. So meetings don't need to be just about production and being productive in your job. Remember the social aspects and the cohesion and the teamwork and the culture that still needs to be developed.
Thanks, Sarah. Very, very good tips. Okay, so before we finish up, I'm going to go around in order of the speakers' presentation. So we'll start with you, Rochelle. What is the one positive that has come from being able to work more flexibly in rural Australia?
I think for me, it's been able to spend more time with my 2 boys, because I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. We're very busy little humans, but it's been nice to be able to have that reconnection with them, even when they were schooling from home and the internet was having a moment, trying to work and school them at the same time. But it has been nice to have that new newly connected family time, I think, and capacity to, I guess, manage my diary more proactively for them has been really useful for me as well. So it just means that I can attend more functions for them because I can negotiate how that's going to look as far as my work outcomes go. And I've had to really learn how to block time out for myself so that I can do that kind of life management piece as well as do the working piece. But I think they're the benefits for me. That's one of the big positives that's come out of it.
Thank you. Jo?
Thanks, Leonie. I have to agree with Rochelle. You know, I was a little bit concerned. I'd always thought that I needed that human interaction with other people, you know, face-to-face stuff. And I was a bit concerned. My husband works from home too. He's a musician. And I thought that working from home with him full time might have been an issue, but I haven't poked him in the eye with a knitting needle yet, and we're 2 years in, so I reckon that's pretty good. But by the same token, I actually feel more connected to my community, as we were saying before we started the presentation. Prior to the pandemic, I was doing 11 international journeys a year, and also on top of that, domestic travel as well. So it certainly doesn't cap what Charmin was doing when she was ambassador, but it certainly was a great deal. And so I actually felt like I would come home on weekends and I would visit my community. You know, like I didn't feel like I lived here. But now I feel like I'm back and I'm part of the community. I go up to the local post office. They know who I am. I go into the local store and it's, "G'day, Joe. What's on today? How many Zoom calls?" So, you know, I actually feel part of the community, which I had lost that. I didn't realize it, but I had lost that connection. So that's a really big positive for me.
Fabulous. Charmin?
I can relate very much to what you just said there, Joe, because I live in a subdivision at Kayella, where everyone's on about an acre and a bit block, and you didn't have to interact with your neighbours, you know, to live, unless your dog got into their place or whatever. But people started walking more. Kids were, of course, home, walking more. Suddenly outside the front gates of everyone's property were giveaway boxes of lemons and watermelons and everything, all just surplus. There was a real sense of community. My daughter, they started a WhatsApp just for their street to talk about who had a rat test, who, you know, all of that sort of thing. So yes, community built during that period, but then we were the privileged ones who had a home, who had a nice garden to share, lived in a nice part of rural regional Australia that wasn't in drought, flood, mouse plague, whatever. But in terms of me personally in my work, because I didn't have to spend 2.5 hours on the road churning through the city to get to a campus, I was more equal in access to all the international colleagues via Zoom. All of us were, not just me or a few other remote people. Our metro colleagues, all of us were, you know, sharing together in the Pacific some issue on child marriage. So I found I had greater access to the great international debates and specialists and whatever's just at the touch of a finger. As I said before, free. That's still continuing to some extent. But I found it an equaliser in terms of, well, can you come? I know you're, 2.5 hours drive. Can you be at the staff meeting on Wednesday to which I'd always say, yes, I will. But when it was all done remotely, it was, well, of course, we'll all be there on time and no hassle. I think, though, that we've always got to remember, and we've touched on this, the safety in the home. We know that alcohol abuse, alcohol consumption rose dramatically during this period of time. Women who were subject to intimate partner violence were under greater threat, experienced greater degrees of distress and abuse because they couldn't escape. And I think we need to work very hard on this whole business of women, in particular, working from home. How can we be sure that they have still access to anonymous support, collegiate support, even if a lot more people are in their own homes and don't get out and about. So,
yeah, very, very true. Thank you for that, Charmin. Sarah and then Kelly, I'm putting you on notice. You have to come on and tell us what your positive is as well. Sarah.
I think moving to the online world has given women the opportunity to shine. An example might be our cattle society have always met face to face, but they've needed women to help run their meetings and run their competitions. An example would be we switched what was normally like your royal show where you see cows walking around an arena to an online competition. And myself and another female managed that competition, and we exposed the competition. We ended up having over 1,000 people watching it from around the world on Zoom, versus previously there would have been 50 people in a ring or an arena watching it. So we've had an opportunity to shine. Our skills that we have developed in traditional roles, such as administration, have been in demand. And secondly, it has forced some traditional occupations to move online. For myself, I'm a diabetic and I've transitioned onto an insulin pump without meeting with a doctor or a nurse face to face. Traditionally, I would have had to have spent a week in Melbourne and then another week in Melbourne a month later. And that has taken place over 2 hours on Zoom. So I think there's been some really good positive changes there.
Fantastic.
But I still can't wait to get on a plane. I'm sorry.
Yes, it's the issue of rural women. We all like our isolation, but we don't like it 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Kelly.
Oh, thank you. So I think I've got 3 things that have been really different for me. So the first thing is I live 75 k's one way from the office where I'm coming to you from today. I live on a farm in northwest New South Wales. So literally being able to work from home saves me a substantial amount of money from having to put petrol into the car and wear and tear on the car. So there's definitely an economic gain for me straight off the board if I can do that. The other thing is, of course, is that I gain 2 hours of more time. Now that more time for me then becomes the balance that the speakers have been talking to today, to make sure that that doesn't equal 2 more hours of online work time, and that I really manage that really carefully to try and make sure that that becomes, more productive time in terms of, what I might be wanting to do on the farm or in my own now personal free time. So the downside of that is that when I travel in the car, I spend a lot of time on the phone catching up with people, and I probably don't do that quite so much when I don't travel into town and I'm at home. So so I think that they're the things. And the third thing, of course, is that when you're working from home, my partner, of course, is a full-time farmer. And I think the mysteries of what actually happens in offices has always been something that has been very unclear to him. So now he sees just how much time I spend in front of the screen. He sometimes gets to see the absolutely amazing women that I get to work with across rural, remote and regional Australia, and sees that I'm actually on the ground and at home rather than spending endless hours in airports trying to make those connections. So they've been the benefits for me. Thank you.
Fantastic. So with all the negatives that we have seen over the time of the pandemic and prior to that, there has been some absolute positives around working flexibly from home. And I think everybody needs a positive in their day. So thank you, girls. I'm going to do a quick wrap up now because I think we're nearly out of time. Just a reminder that a copy of this webinar presentation will be available on the National Rural Women's Coalition YouTube platform and our website, along with UN Women. I'd like to thank all of our amazing presenters for their depth of knowledge and willingness to share it. It is quite inspirational, as are the women. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Kelly, for managing the tech and keeping us all on time. We hope you have all enjoyed this session, and we look forward to continuing the work for women, and especially rural women in Australia and around the globe. And I'm going to close now and thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.